In the last segment, we saw that Hobbes thinks the foremost thing we should be doing in the state of nature is trying to escape. That is, trying to escape the war of all against all by seeking peace. In order to seek peace, we need to lay down the right of nature. That is, we need to accept limitations on our own rights and have others accept limitations on theirs so that we can get along. So long as I retain the right of nature, I have the right to kill you if it suits me, and you have the right to kill me if it suits you, we'll inevitably end up in conflict. We need to lay down that right, accepting limitations on our rights, in order to escape the war of all against all. How do we do that? We make and abide by contracts. Hobbes says, you might think we can make and abide by contracts simply by making an agreement. I'll say to you, I agree to not kill you if you agree not to kill me, and you say the same to me. But then he points out that nothing is so easily broken as a man's word. We can't simply make an agreement because we'll have no reason to trust it. We'll end up back in the war of all against all. And this raises the question, how should we go about trying to escape from the war of all against all? And Hobbes, as I said last time, considers a few proposals which he rejects before moving on to one that he accepts. So let's look in this segment at the ones he rejects. First, he considers the possibility that maybe we can look to animals, see what they do to escape a war of all against all, and mimic that. But he says this won't work. And the reason it won't work, he thinks, is because we are too different from ordinary animals. And there's three particular differences that he points to. First, he says, animals don't lie, but we do. Second, animals have some predisposition to cooperate that we lack. And third, animals don't distinguish between harm and injustice, but we do. So let's look at these each briefly. So he says animals never lie, but of course humans can. And again, we can ask, is this empirically accurate? That is this an accurate description of the facts about the world? And in fact, it's not. So it's well known that there are animals that deceive their cohorts. So for example, the great apes are very good at this. They have what, looking at their behavior, we would say is a belief that one thing is true, but they then act as if something else is true in order to make someone who's observing them come to a false belief. It looks like they lie. What about a predisposition to cooperate? Well, it's true that some animals are predisposed to cooperate, but Hobbes claims we're not, and that's not at all obvious. There are mechanisms, it seems, that predispose us to cooperate. For example, emotional contagion. Emotional contagion occurs when I see you express some intense emotion, like intense anger or intense fear or intense happiness, and I kind of catch that emotion. It makes me feel intense anger or fear or happiness, depending on which you're expressing. So some think that emotional contagion is part of the basis for animal cooperation. And if that's right, since emotional contagion occurs in humans as well, perhaps we have a similar basis for cooperation. Third, Hobbes distinguishes between harm and injustice. He says that animals always identify harm with injustice, but we don't, and this will prevent us from being able to get along in the way that they do. So here's Hobbes' idea. Suppose you have two dogs, dog A and dog B, and dog A harms dog B, perhaps A bites B. B will never consider this possibility. Well, maybe it was appropriate for A to harm me because I had stolen A's bone earlier in the week. That is, B will think, if A has harmed me, that was wrong, that was bad. Whereas in humans, we just don't do that, right? It's often the case that we think, okay, that person harmed me, but they were justified in doing it. It was appropriate. Or I harmed that person, but that person deserved it. It was appropriate. Why does this matter? Well, Hobbes thinks in animals, anytime you see one animal harm another, if you're, say, the pack leader, you know that that was wrong, so you just put a stop to it, or you punish the person who commits harm. But in humans, we can't do that because we draw this distinction between harm and injustice. And he thinks that's an importantly will prevent us from getting along. Okay, so having dismissed the possibility that we can look to what animals do and sort of mimic them, Hobbes considers the possibility that we can make and abide by contracts in order to seek peace by deploying standard methods of democracy. Now remember, Hobbes was living at a time when there were democratic revolutions against the royalists, against the kings, against the monarchy, and Hobbes was very much against these democratic revolutions and very much in favor of the monarchs whom he served. So it's unsurprising that he's going to say democracy won't work. But let's look at what he says about democracy. So here's the idea. Hobbes says, imagine we have two people here, and one of them thinks, I may not know much, but I'm smarter than Orange. And the other thinks, I may not know much, but I'm smarter than Maroon. Well, why would each think this? Remember Hobbes's earlier claim that each person thinks herself to be the wisest. Why does each person think that? Remember, it wasn't supposed to be an especially controversial claim. The idea was, I believe that my beliefs are the right ones. Otherwise, they wouldn't be my beliefs. It's trivial that I believe my beliefs are the right ones. And you believe your beliefs are the right ones. Again, otherwise they wouldn't be your beliefs. So whenever we disagree, I think, in effect, that I'm wiser than you are. And you think, in effect, that you're wiser than me. And that's why he thinks each person will think that that person herself is smarter than the next. So if you think you're smarter than the next person, then you think your view of what's best is better than the next person's. So each of these people thinks their view of how, say, government should be set up is the correct view. Now, suppose Maroon thinks that we should have a large police force that carries no weapons, that that's the best way to ensure security. And Orange thinks that we should have a very small but heavily armed police force. Well, now they have a disagreement about how society should be set up, and each person thinks that her opinion or his opinion is the correct one. So there's going to be conflict. So here's the argument. Each person thinks she's smarter than the next. Consequently, each thinks her view is correct. People have different views. Consequently, there's bound to be conflict. Now, Hobbes, you might think that's no big deal, that we should just say, okay, conflict is not a problem. There's going to be conflict and we can resolve it in some ordinary way. But remember, we're talking about how to escape the war of all against all. I'm at your throat, you're at mine, it's a big bloodbath. There's no trust, there's no government, there's no one to enforce broken rules, broken agreements. Now we're trying to get out of that. Do we do it by getting together and sort of having further disagreements about how society should be set up? Hobbes thinks that would be incredibly foolish. That's just going to further the war of all against all. It's not a way out, it's a way to ensure its continuance. Now we get to Hobbes' solution. He thinks what we need to do is pick a leader and give that leader all the power. Again, knowing about Hobbes' life, knowing that he was sort of a supporter of the king, of the monarchs, and arguing on their behalf, you might worry that this is a bit self-serving. But let's set that aside and take his argument at face value. And that's what we'll do in the next segment.